And I used to be nervous about giving people feedback because I didn't know how they'd respond or whether they agree. And what I found was people were incredibly receptive and they wanted it, but they wanted to make sure that they received it when it was good for them. So I know, Alex, you and I had conversations, and I'd start off and I'd say, hey, do you mind if I give you some feedback? And there were times when you actually say, I'm having a pretty bad day. Can we catch up? Can you put that on hold, DR, and maybe we can catch up on it tomorrow? But it ensured that not only was I asking for permission, but it was being delivered at a time when you were going to be receptive. And because we built that trust, you knew it was okay to say, hey, now isn't a good time.
Welcome to the Rising Leader Podcast, bringing forth the new wave of rising leadership and helping leaders find purpose, connection, and results. This is your host, founder of Alluviance, Alex Kremer. What is up, y'all? Welcome back to the Rising Leader Podcast. And if this is your first time joining us on the show, we welcome you. As always, this is your host, Alex Kremer. I'm excited about today's conversation. We have a very good one with one of the best sales leaders that I know of, one of the best sales leaders that I have worked for, the famous and well-known Mr. David Rubinstein. So, David, DR actually is the right way to say it. What's up, DR? Good to see you, man.
Yeah, it's great to see you. I know this has been a long time coming, so I'm really excited to be here.
Me too, man. Me too. Well, DR, I'm gonna give a little bit of a backstory in terms of who you are, how I got to know you, and we're gonna dive into some good stuff around how to build an effective culture, how to be a great sales leader, how to hire correctly, and stuff along those lines. But just a little background for those who don't know. So, DR, you spent almost 6 years or so at Salesforce. And after 6 years in essentially the middle of the pandemic, you decided to take a chance on this little known company called Outreach. And you joined in April of 2020. And the story of how you and I initially met, so you had come over to be the VP of sales of our East Coast team. And we were based in Seattle. So the East Coast team was very, very minimal, less than I think 5 people or so. And I was running a team meeting for our West Coast commercial team, and you hopped on the Zoom call just to kind of listen to how it went. And it was just a classic good all team meeting. And that night, Mark Cosaglo, who was, I think he was the SVP of sales at the time, gave me a call. He's like, hey, just so you know, David, the new VP of sales at the EC, is going to give you a call tomorrow, and he's going to potentially ask you a life-altering question. And I was like, oh man, I know exactly where this question is going. And lo and behold, you called me the next day and you said, Alex, I attended your team meeting yesterday. It was really good. I've heard that you're a really big culture guy. He's like, listen, I'm looking to build the East Coast team and curious if you thought about moving to New York and help me do it. And I initially said no, because I was living with a house, with a partner, with a dog in Seattle. And then I think I gave you a call back about 24 hours later, and I was like, so tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking here. And for the next, we worked together for about 3, maybe even close to 4 years or so. We built out our New York office, and I learned an absolute ton from you about just sales, about leadership, around culture building. And you're famous with we call them DR-isms, of just like good little nuggets to be able to share. So I'm excited to have you on the show and just to tap into some of the wisdom that you have, my friend.
Well, I mean, first of all, we won't highlight it a ton on the podcast, but we had a lot of fun, and I think that was part of the success that we had together. Was we made it fun, right? But if I take a step back, before I had the conversation with you, I was brand new in the role at Outreach. I think the West Coast team was 5x the size of the East Coast team. The biggest competitor was on the East Coast, and the footprint was somewhat limited. And I knew that the one thing that we had to focus on in order to be successful was how can we scale onboarding. And as I thought about that as kind of the one challenge walking into a new role, I then thought about, okay, well, how do I attack this? Because normally for onboarding, Outreach would send people out to Seattle. They would go through a rigorous training, and they'd come back and they know how to sell. But with COVID, happening. Supply lines were shot. There was no chance of sending people out to Seattle. So all the onboarding was really going to be dependent on what I could do or what I could do with the AEs that I had. And I just felt like people doing something part-time will never be as effective as someone having full accountability and ownership. And saw you on a call. I was like, that guy's pretty good. I think he could be better, but I think that guy's pretty good. And I think we could build something great together. So that's when I called you.
I'd say one of the things that I love about you is you were the type of leader, you pushed people hard. It was always with love. It was always from the right place. It was never like, man, he's, really like making me not feel good about myself. But like you challenged people in an extremely powerful way that, it's kind of like a manufacturing line. You'd come in as just like, hey, I'm a good sales manager, or I know kind of how to sell. And, you go through the DR system, and on the other end, you'd be like, oh man, I have a process. I have a plan. I know the skill sets necessary. I know the right questions to ask. Like you knew very well what it took to build a great sales rep, a great sales team, and great sales leaders as well, which, I don't think many people have at least a methodology like you have. I guess I'd just be curious. It's like, does this come just from being in sales for as long as you were, from being in leadership for as long as you were? Was it from being at Salesforce and the methodology they taught there? Like all this stuff that you've learned that you continually bring to different types of sales teams and cultures, like where have you gathered all of this knowledge from?
I think my experience at Salesforce was really transformative from a career standpoint. So I think one of the things that happens at Salesforce is every year you start over with a new team. So you have a certain percentage of your sellers get promoted, a certain percentage decide to go to another sales team within the company, and some stay. So you're really every year, every kind of year, you're shaking up the snow globe and seeing how it looks, and so one of the things that gets you pretty good at is putting in a structure with new people that realistically are only going to be with you for a year. So my philosophy became, if you're only going to be with me for a year, I want to make sure that year is the best experience in your career. I want you to look back on the 12 months we spent together and go, wow, that was great. I learned a lot. Converse of that is, for me, I had a new boss every year. So it was both good news and bad news. I think that, when you have a boss and you work with them for a number of years, you get comfortable, right? You know what they're like, you know what they want, they know your skills, your opportunities, and you're a vertical couple, and you get used to kind of the idiosyncrasies of your relationship, and it just works. So imagine if every year you get a new boss. It's really tough, and it's really uncomfortable, but sometimes the best progress comes from situations that are a little bit uncomfortable. And so by getting somebody new every year, yes, I had to learn what they liked, but I took something away from each person that I worked for, and that was really valuable for my career. So when I left Salesforce, I'd worked for 6 different leaders who were all great leaders and all had things that made them unique. And I tried to take the things that I felt were most effective from each one, and maybe layer in some of my own things over time. And that's kind of helped me develop a style.
Yeah, I remember you going through your Rolodex at various times. You're like, oh yeah, this person I used to work for, he's now CRO of this company. Oh, this person I used to work for, now she's, CRO or doing, Chief Growth Officer over here. And it's like, wow, you definitely came from a lineage, so to speak, of like really powerful leaders who just continue to go, well and above in their career. And, one thing that I remember when you came in, to outreach and you brought into our team was this idea of the one thing. And I think this is kind of just like a fun place to start here, of like, you would always bring this up to me, just like, Alex, what's your one thing? Or you'd always bring this up to a sales rep of what's your one thing that you're focused on? And you really lived and embodied this message yourself. I mean, you were, so to speak, a a broken record of like, hey, this is the thing we're driving over and over and over again, and it worked. I would love for you to expand on what that methodology is, or that piece right there, the one thing.
Well, the one thing is I wish I could take credit for it. It's a book by Gary Keller that focuses on what's the one thing that you can do that will make everything else easier, right? And so if you can identify what that is, it really is a great way to stay focused and understand, like, what do I have to do? I always cringe when people talk about being busy, right? I got, and everyone talks about kind of being busy or having back to backs, and they wear this as a badge of honor. To me, busy is the enemy of productive. And what I want people I work with to focus on is like, what's the thing that really matters? There's a lot of stuff that you can do that can fill your calendar, but what's the thing that you can do that's really going to move the needle? And how do you make sure that not only are you spending the most time on it, but that should be the first thing that you focus on? Like, you should be, because it's everybody kind of has their list of things to check off. And you get that little dopamine hit when you check something off, and you check something off and you feel good about that. But at the end of the day, you could check a bunch of things off in a given day and none of them really matter. And so the concept to me of the one thing is like, how do we stay laser focused on what's really going to matter and have an impact?
Mm. Yeah. And the one thing that, when you came on, you talked about was hiring and onboarding. And you had a really fun way that you would go about hiring people. And we didn't always see eye to eye, I would say, on who we were supposed to hire. You taught me a lot about like just even how to go about an interview and how you need to have the right questions and really push people. But that, from my understanding, what I remember is like your one thing was like, let's get the right people on and let's onboard them effectively here. How did you go about that process there in terms of finding the right candidates and making sure that, we got them to where they needed to be?
Well, when you start with kind of finding the right candidates, you have to have a clear definition of what the profile of that candidate looks like. What are both the experiences that candidate has had, but equally important, what are the skills that they bring to the table? And so once you identify that, building out a consistent set of questions that can be asked not only by, if it's you, the hiring manager, but what do you want your HR or people team, what do you want that person to ask in their questions? What do you want your solutions consultant to ask? What are the things that they're looking for? So it's really important to make sure that everyone has defined things that they're looking for, and specific questions to ask. Because if you don't, it turns into, yeah, I liked them. They, I think they'd be a really good fit for the culture. And you get kind of these squishy responses from people
I feel
that
targeted
really aren't based on specifics.
I feel very targeted based on that statement right there. So what were you specifically for? I mean, because you would do a couple of things. You had this 3 adjectives sort of thing that you would be asking people. You talked about kind of just like phone calls that you would make as well. Like, what was your way that you would go about that?
As far as identifying the right candidates?
Mm-hmm. That, and also once they got on board, how did you make sure that they were set up for success to be producing as quickly as possible?
Well, once they got on board, I mean, that was really my favorite part of my job. Was always, I started something a bunch of years ago that I've always continued, is the day someone joins my team or organization, I call them usually within an hour of them signing the offer letter. So it's a really fun call to be able to make. And imagine you're making a career change and you're super excited, and you told your family, and you're a little bit nervous, but you're excited. And then you get a phone call, comes in on your cell. You don't recognize the number, but you pick it up for whatever reason. And it's the person that you're reporting to, or maybe it's your boss's boss or your boss's boss's boss, just calling you just to say, I appreciate you. We're thrilled that you're joining the company. And here's one thing that I noticed during the interview process that was what I refer to as, you had me at hello, that moment. when I had, and when I could be specific with a person, not just I thought you were great, I wanted you on the team, but I was really impressed with how you asked this question and when you said this or specifics, just to say, hey, look, I noticed you, I saw something in you, I want to invest in you, and I'm pumped you're going to be on the team. That one phone call, I've talked to people that I hired years later, and they've told me that they remember that call. So I think that's one thing that I do with new hires that's worked really well. Another thing that I do is I do the three adjectives. And three adjectives is a video. Videos by Carla Harris, who's a chairman of Morgan Stanley, and she's a woman who talks about, what are the things that are really going to help you move in your career. And what she says is the most important conversations that take place in your career are those where you're not in the room. And so if you know that's the case, what are the three adjectives that you want people to use to describe you when you're not in the room? And I send everyone who joins my org a 15-minute video so they can learn about the three adjectives. And then I set up a one-on-one and I ask them, what are your three adjectives? And it's a really rich way of learning more about them without being super awkward. And then invariably, you could tell someone's kind of thinking about something and there's an adjective that they weren't really sure about. And I'll always ask, I'll say, hey, I noticed you started to say this, but you changed your mind. Was there something that you wish you could have listed as an adjective? And they say, well, yeah. And that becomes my way of understanding like what's an area that they want to develop without saying on first call, hey, what's a weakness? Right. And it's a great way of learning more about that person. And then I share mine. So I'm fully transparent with them. And I say, hey, these are the three adjectives that I use to describe myself. And I hope that as we get to know each other, you'll agree.
Mm-hmm. What I think it allowed, you to show is you were very inviting to people who joined. It was like, hey, welcome to our team. Like that personal touch goes above and beyond because not every skip level or skip level does something like that. And it's like welcoming them to the crew. But what it also is doing is you're saying, hey, I actually really want to get to know you. Not just, be here and be a revenue producer or help us hit quota, but like, hey, let me actually get to understand you as a person. I think that was something that was, very noted by many people who ended up joining our New York team, our East Coast team. And, there was countless times where someone would close a deal, whether it would be a 10K deal or a 200K deal, that they would get a personal call from you. And you weren't even their skip level, right? You were, 3 levels above them. And just be like, hey, just wanted to give you a call and just say, hey, great work on that. And, there's something to that just made people feel very just part of something bigger. And, you weren't always in the weeds as much or anything like that, but it was just like those small, tiny things that says like, hey, what's up, brother? I care about you.
Well, I think one of the things I thought back to, earlier in my career when a senior leader would send me a note or leave me a voicemail that said something positive that I did, I saved those. And, sometimes when I'd have a rough day and, you have those moments of self-doubt, I'd go back and I'd read that note and I go, I got this. And I've just always kind of felt like I know what that meant to me. And I know, leadership is a responsibility. And you can have a big impact on people, and it's an honor and a privilege, and you have to use it appropriately. But it's a waste if you don't use it to encourage people and energize people. And so I do my best to make sure that people know I appreciate them.
So once you joined and once you recruited me over to the New York team, we built out this really awesome sales organization. And you built out an even larger team. You included solution consultants, CSMs, different people like that. I think you grew from 5 to 50 people or something along those lines on the East Coast over the next 2.5, 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to throw this in here, but there was I think it was FY21 or FY22, I can't remember, but we ended up being the number one sales team out of like 45 different teams. And that was like one of the most awesome experiences that I'd ever had of opening an office, working under you, hiring a completely new sales team, onboarding them, building pipeline, closing revenue, teaching people how to sell. And there was a swagger to the East team. We even had these really cool custom made outreach sweatshirts with East on the sleeve right there that everybody wore. And it was like it was like, hey man, we're different. We're not the West Coast team. And you brought in a lot of, like, and I referenced this earlier, a lot of DRisms. And these were things that you repeated over and over again till you ingrained them into people's minds. And once they were ingrained in there or coded in there, then you'd move on to the next. It felt like you had a very very intentional process for how you went about it. And one of the first things that you did when you came in is you realized that we would get to the very end of a deal cycle, and then we'd lose the deal for whatever reason, right? It would slip, that wasn't part of their priorities, they didn't have budget, whatever it might be. And you asked one question on every pipeline review for the next 6 to 12, maybe even just the entire, for the rest of the time. Do you remember what that question was? The first question you always asked.
What's the problem?
What's the problem? And that was like, it got to the point where people were like, oh my God, DR is going to ask me, what's the problem that we're trying to solve for with the prospect? Every single time. If we start getting, okay, here's the deal, DR, we got this person, you'd be like, hey, can you stop real quick? What's the problem we're trying to solve for? And it was just a fundamental sales shift in terms of how we went about closing business. And I'd love for you to just kind of double click into why you did that, or what that whole philosophy was about. What's the problem?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think for me, when I think about what's the problem, it's really about being consistent. It's about saying, you know what? I don't want there to be surprises about the questions that I'm going to ask. I'm not trying to trick you or inspect what you're doing. I'm really just trying to say, what's the problem? What's the problem we're trying to solve? And you should know that every single time. So whenever we talk about a deal, you should know these are the questions that matter, and these are the things that are important.
Mm-hmm. And you get a lot of people, right? A lot of times when people would say, this is the problem we're trying to solve for is they need more pipeline, or the problem we're trying to solve for is, we're giving them better analytics into their sales pipeline. And it's like, I've heard you say many times, you're like, that's our values, our value of our product. That's not actually the problem that they're trying to solve for. And so you would push back a lot of times of like, we really don't know what we're trying to solve for, both from a ATL perspective, right? The executive priorities, and a BTL perspective, the who are the everyday users of it.
One way maybe I'd say it, if I can, a little bit differently, is there's what's the problem, and so the problem is we don't have enough pipeline, or that might be a standard thing that a seller would say is the problem. And I think my response is typically, my hunch is that that's been a problem for years. Like they've always, since the beginning of time, they would always say that. So the next question that you always want to ask is, what's changed to make solving that problem actually matter? Right? Because if nothing's changed, and they've lived with that pain for 5 years, it's just numb at this point, or they've found a workaround. But I think the question you always want to ask that follow on is, what's changed? Because what's changed is, well, we just hired a new CRO, and that new CRO is reporting pipeline every week to the board. What's changed is we had a terrible earnings call, and if we look at, and we lowered our guidance for future quarters, everyone's looking at pipeline. So understanding, what's changed in the business is really the thing that takes the what's the problem we're trying to solve and makes it more real, right? Another thing is in every business, well, everything we're doing is manual. Okay, well, my guess is it's been manual since the beginning of the company, and the company's done okay. So what's changed to make the need to automate? Well, we have to hire this many more people, or the volume of calls that we have coming in or customer service issues that we have to deal with are significantly higher, and we can't do something manual anymore. Like we need to automate it, right? Like those are the kinds of things. So if you can get to the what's changed, that's really kind of what puts a finer point on what's the problem we're trying to solve.
Mm. You also had a really powerful framework. It was kind of like back of the napkin math, 5-step framework of question asking to help to quantify the pain. And I think that was one of the beauties, and I'd love for you to dive into it, but that was one of the beauties that you brought as a sales leader is you gave people a structure to go about things. When they heard something, you knew triggered me to say something. Like I even remember another one when someone would bring up, oh, my CEO doesn't care, or, said something about this. Be like, oh, you say your CEO? Like, what does your CEO care about? Like you ingrained it into people's minds that when they brought up their boss, you'd always ask them, what does your boss care about? But, this 5-step question framework, I'd love for you to kind of share about this one, because this one changed how people did discovery.
Yeah, it's funny. This one resonated with folks. I think of everything that I've ever posted on LinkedIn. I think this is the one thing that all of a sudden people are like, oh, I like that. So this is something that I actually narrowed it down to 4 steps. And I think one of the things is, as Alex, you know about me, is I'm all about a good acronym and taking things and turning them into acronyms. So my acronym was MATH. And the acronym stands for metric, actual, target, and the H is holding you back, right? And so if you think about metric, so if we play this through, we're talking to a company. What's the one metric that if you could solve this would really change your business? If you could change that metric, well, the metric is pipeline. Okay, great. And where are you actually right now with your pipeline? How are you performing? Well, we're doing $50,000 a month per rep. Okay, great. What's the target that you have per rep? It's 100,000. Okay, so you got 50,000 is the goal. The target is 100,000. Wow, so you're missing by 50,000 a rep. How many reps did you say you have? I have 10. Wow. So 50, a miss of 50 times 10 reps is 500,000 a month times 12. Wow. So you have a $6 million shortfall of pipeline. So really quick, kind of that's the back of the napkin math that you get them to kind of agree to the numbers. And sometimes what will happen is your numbers will be way off. The assumptions that I make, or they will be way off. And the person will say, well, actually, it's probably closer to this. Or, great. And so it's okay to be wrong. So now I know there's a $6 million pipe gap. And I go, wow, okay. Talk to me about what's holding you back. And the what's holding you back, well, we have the sales team's working on too many things, or our emails our response rates are down, but that the problem is the what's holding you back. And I think if we did throw in a 5th question into that, 5th question is, who's the executive that cares about solving that problem? Right? And if you can start to go through math, and then who's the executive that cares, you have a problem that's quantified, an executive who cares about solving it. And if you can start to understand that, and then you overlay the what's changed in the business, then you really have a problem that's worth solving, that someone will invest money to solve.
What I loved about that question framework is it does a couple of things. First off, if you're the rep and you ask the question, hey, what's the metric, right? And let's just say it's meetings booked or whatever it might be. You already know the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th follow-up question that you're going to be asking. So there's a certain sense of confidence that you're going. I think a lot of reps, especially when they ask a question, they're listening to the answer like, oh my God, like they're going to be done answering this pretty soon here, and I'm going to have to either ask a follow-up question or say something, or like there's like an anxiousness that comes from this. So like you're giving people guide rails of, hey, this is actually, a very powerful process to go through here. But what it's also doing is when the prospect says, $50,000, yeah, times by, 10 reps by 12, like, oh my God, now that you say that, wow, we have a $6 million gap that we're not hitting. Like, as the sales professional, you're kind of moving more into a consultative type of role because you're helping them realize the size of the problem that they're experiencing.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's really important with this is to do it in a way that's conversational. So it feels like a conversation versus an interrogation. It's very easy to start off and say, "Hey, so what's the metric that's most important?" And then like, "All right, great. Well, so how you doing against that?" It's feeling like a conversation versus I'm just rattling off a stream of consciousness, a bunch of questions, and I'm hoping I'm going to land on something of value.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you'll find is that the prospect is much more receptive to someone who is having a conversation with them versus someone who walks in and is just like, well, I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions, bunch of standard discovery questions so that I can demo to you on the next call. Like there's nothing that frustrates an executive more than the generic questions. But a conversation with someone who feels like they can actually help your business and it has a more consultative approach is generally much better received.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, so I love the math acronym, and I love how you've shortened it from 5 questions down to 4 questions. You do love a good acronym. You've done that like so many times. One of my favorite DRisms as well was find the friction. And, you always talked about this. It's like if you're getting yeses and yeses and yeses, your sales IQ should come online and say like, something's off here. And you really push people to get to the friction. I'd love for you to expand on that methodology. Well, find the friction.
Yeah. So, the way I think about it is too much good is actually bad. We've all been on calls where there's a lot of head nodding and a lot of yeses and everything's yes. And at the end of the call, they weren't saying, send me a contract. They got off the call and everybody felt good and there was no next call scheduled. And it just, that's how it ends. So finding the friction is really about getting to, do we really have a deal? Is this something that we're working toward? What are the things that are going to prevent us from getting the deal? And so that's when the deal actually starts. And so if you think about it very simply as if you walk into a car dealership and you're gonna buy a car, and you're walking around and you're looking at the car, and the salesperson comes over and says, "Hey, any questions?" You're like, "No, I'm good. Really beautiful car," and maybe you ask some really high level questions, and then you walk away. And there wasn't a deal because the questions that you were asking weren't buying questions. They weren't hard questions. They weren't like, well, tell me how the financing works. Tell me how that, like, that's the friction when it's like, oh, I didn't realize the interest rate was so high, or like, but getting to that, I think it's counterintuitive for a lot of sellers because that's when things get hard. And that's when you start to get into the unknown. And that's where you start to get objections. And I think so many people are trained to swim where the water is warm and just go where it's easy versus go head on. Just go right after the hardest thing. Go after the thing that they're going to object with. Because if you can't get by that friction, you're not going to get a deal. And if someone isn't giving you any friction, they're not really evaluating seriously. So it's good to find that out sooner than later. So that's why I always encourage, like, get to friction fast. And if you haven't found any friction, there's no deal. You haven't got you're not working on anything.
Well, I remember I think you were talking to one of the reps on our team. His name is Ross, and you were saying like, hey, if he's giving you a yes, this is looking good. I like this. I like. You got to get to the friction somewhere at the other. Be like, man, it seems so good to you. Like, why don't I just shoot over the DocuSign? You sign this thing off. Let's get going. And, once you do something like that, they're like, well, we need to think about some things. I need to get other people involved, whatever it might be. But it's like, doing something that's a little bit like pattern interrupting. Because if it's even kind of bringing in, you always talked about a healthy amount of skepticism to your deals as well. You used to say, hey, don't tell me all the reasons why you're going to win this deal. Tell me all the reasons why you could potentially lose it. And thinking just a small reframe like that, it completely changed how we did, all of our sales pipeline reviews, how we, analyzed our deals.
Well, so salespeople are often optimistic and positive, and they have happy ears. And while the optimism and the positivity are generally good things, it can sometimes cloud your judgment. And it's very easy to envision how the deal is going to come in and how all the things are going to line up, and that doesn't prepare you for reality, and it doesn't prepare you for the last minute challenges that you face. So what I always look for is I want sellers to think about, like, where could this go wrong? Where could this go off the tracks? And then what's our strategy to make sure that it doesn't? What can we do to mitigate risk? And that's really important. And the best sellers that I've worked with always have a healthy degree of skepticism, and they're looking for where the risk is and what are the things I can do to reduce the risk.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, I've got like a whole list right here of probably 10 to 15 other DRisms, whether you want to call it 3 Ps of pipeline, the soldier versus the magician. I mean, I would love to hear from you. What are some of your favorite, I don't know if you call them DRisms because that's literally your own name, but like any of your favorite things that we haven't spoken of here that you typically bring to your sales team or your culture?
Well, I think the concept of soldiers and magicians is a good one, and that was borrowed from a book, and I'm drawing a blank on the book, but it really talked about a couple different types of sellers. You have soldiers and you have magicians, and magicians are people that have a natural skill and a way of doing something that's really often tied to their personality, and it's not something that others can replicate. And you have soldiers who require structure and a playbook and real clear instructions. And the best sales teams are often a mixture of both. I think the challenge comes when you try to have soldiers copy magicians, because invariably what happens, particularly in startups, is you have a few magicians who are magically pulling in deals early on. And the thought is, okay, we'll just have the soldiers we'll hire soldiers, we'll have them do what the magicians do, and we'll scale the business. And that's not always effective. And I think that the best teams that I've been a part of have been able to take what maybe a magician is doing and translate it into a way that can make others successful with their own personalities and their own styles, because it's not typically effective to have people who have one style need to lose who they are as a seller in order to try to copy someone else. So I think the concept of soldiers and magicians and understanding the talent that you have on the team and how to best leverage it and how to best leverage the people that are having success and translate where they're having success into ways that other people can leverage. I think I found a lot of success with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd even relate that to how you managed, me. Is I would love to say that I'm a magician in certain types of ways, but I love to be, treated like a soldier, of like, I need a process. And, you had a certain way of, in our one-on-ones, you're like, hey, we're going through these 3 different types of things. It's like people, pipeline, big bets. It's like, we're talking about your people. We're talking about how your pipeline is. We're talking about what any big bets are, either big deals or projects that you're actually working on. And it was a framework that we could go through on a consistent basis, right? So there was no gotchas, right? How we structured our leadership meetings with everybody else. You had a Google Doc of here was the key things that we went through every single week. So there was never a point where I was like, oh man, I was not expecting DR to bring up this metric or talk about this. Like there was always something that you allowed us to show up and be ready to succeed. You never tried to get us. And that's not easy to do. It takes a certain level of just discipline on your end as a leader, because you also were dealing with the CRO and the CEO and the SVP of RevOps, breathing down your neck of saying, "Hey, DR, what's going on here?" Especially right in the midst of a pandemic and a tech collapse, so to speak. And it's just like, I guess I'd love just even like kind of from a higher level of like, when you think of people who have aspirations to move up to the VP of sales or lead an entire sales organization, or even beyond a sales organization, to CSMs, to social solutions consultants, to various people like that, do you have any advice or perspective on what you think about for yourself around how you are holding yourself accountable to being just a really great leader?
Well, I think in order to lead effectively, you have to have things that you hold yourself accountable to. And I think one of the first things that I do when I start meeting with new teams is I talk about the three things that I hold myself accountable to, right? And the first thing is at least for people as part of my organization that are sellers. I think where I always start is I want you to be successful financially. And I think we've all been on teams where a few people sell and make a ton of money and the business gets to the numbers that it needs, but the majority of people aren't doing well and aren't being successful. And so I start off by saying my goal is to make sure that everybody is contributing and is rewarded and is successful. So we got to get everybody to at least 70% of their number, right? So that's kind of what I refer to as participation, but we want to get everybody to a number. Because if you're not making money, the other stuff doesn't matter. If everyone has financial responsibilities. And so it doesn't matter how much fun it is, doesn't matter all these different things. So the first piece is do we have people kind of getting to at least 70%? The second thing that I always look for is, and I go back to my time at Salesforce, where my assumption was we'd work together for only a year. If we're only working together for a year, you're reasonably talented right now. A year from now, if you're at the same level that you're at right now, I failed. Right. So we have to kind of partner together to make sure that you're continuing to grow so that you can take on more, do more, you're creating more career opportunities for yourself. So first is financial, second is kind of skill based. And the third is when your head hits the pillow at night, do you feel good about what you're doing? Do you feel good about what you're building? Do you feel like you're respected by the people that you work with and for? Do you have the same level of respect? Do you feel like you're making a difference? And if you can answer yes to all three, my hunch is you're going to stick around. And so that's kind of usually how I start off meeting with new teams and talking about it. And when I introduce myself, I always let them know, like, these are the three things that matter most to me. And I, as a leader, the first foundational thing you have to do is kind of build trust, because nothing you do matters if the people that you work with and for don't know that you have their best interest in mind. So, I always say kind of no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. The little things really matter. So knowing when someone's birthday is, knowing what's going on with their family, like that stuff really matters. And investing the time. I always start off when I get a new team, I go into my Google Calendar, I manually insert everyone's birthday and everyone's anniversary, working. So I can text them on that day. But those little things really, really matter. And when they know that you care, then it's easier to have expectations, right? So the first foundation is kind of trust. Second is like, this is how it's going to be, and being really clear on the expectations. And I think one of the things that I see a lot of first-time leaders, like mistakes that I see them make, is they worry about being liked, and they worry about being popular, and how the team feels about them. And I used to think that, and please don't take this as like I want people to hate me or whatever. But what I found is that most people that I've worked with want to get better, and they want to be challenged, and they want to win. And so if you can create an environment where people know you have their best interest in mind, you want to help them make money and win, as long as that gives you kind of a really good foundation. And then you say, hey, we were just on this call together. Do you mind if I give you some feedback? And asking for permission. And I used to be nervous about giving people feedback because I didn't know how they'd respond or whether they agree. And what I found was people were incredibly receptive, and they wanted it, but they wanted to make sure that they received it when it was good for them. So I know, Alex, you and I had conversations, and I'd start off and I'd say, hey, do you mind if I give you some feedback? And there were times when you actually say, I'm having a pretty bad day. Can we catch up? Can you put that on hold, DR, and maybe we can catch up on it tomorrow? Mm-hmm. But it ensured that not only was I asking for permission, but it was being delivered at a time when you were gonna be receptive. And because we built that trust, you knew it was okay to say, "Hey, now isn't a good time." Mm-hmm. And that's why that trust foundation is. It can't be minimized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was because you had gotten to know me, right? I mean, through all those small things around the little calls, the knowing when your birthday is, asking the 3 adjectives, all of that had built up a level of like, okay, he's not just wanting to make me or push me to be better. He's just simply wanting to get to know me. And so when I knew that you had my best interest in mind, when it came to you giving me feedback, I'd be like, oh yeah, DR knows me. I want this. And I truly, like, the type of sales leader I was before I met you compared to what I was afterwards, it was night and day. And I know many other leaders and sales reps who can say the exact same thing because of some of the stuff that you spoke to here. And I love what you said too around, like, so many first-time sales leaders or early sales leaders just want to be liked. And, that's especially for millennials. I think that's like a big thing for us, is like, we really want to be liked. But that sometimes goes against actually being respected and actually getting the results that you're looking for. So I have one more question for you here, DR. And before I ask you, I do just want to acknowledge you, man, of like, dude, we used to call you Professor DR of like, and that was exactly what we were trying to, I wanted to share with people on this podcast here of like, you've got so much wisdom to give, but you articulate it and you share it and deliver it in a really powerful and consumable / easy to understanding way that people can implement very, very quickly. And there's a few things from this call that I'm like, I need to start doing that shit again. So thank you for sharing that. Here's my last question for you, DR. And it's one of my favorite questions. We've spoken to it a little bit here, but this show is obviously called the Rising Leader Podcast. My question for you is, what do you view as the rising leader?
I think the rising leader is intentional, is maniacal about focus, knows what are the few things that really move the needle. If you think about where we are today, there are more technologies that you can use. There are more channels that you can leverage. There are more ways of interacting with customers. There's a lot of stuff that's thrown at new leaders. And the best kind of new rising leaders are able to distill all the things that come at you into a framework of a few things that really matter, and then are able to plan their day, week, month, quarter, and develop kind of an operating rhythm in order to address those 4 things, because there's always going to be stuff. So I would just encourage you, if you find yourself saying, I'm back to back, I'm super busy, I'm whatever, I think you got to rethink your approach. I think that the most effective new leaders are going to be the ones that can be really intentional, do few things really well, and are going to have a really strong operating rhythm to support doing those few things. So each day, week, month, quarter, there are fewer things that you have to think about because you've just built in a rhythm. Every Tuesday, I look at this report. Every Wednesday, I host this call. Every Thursday, like, the more of those things that you build into your rhythm, I think the more effective someone will be as a leader.
Beautiful. And that's another DRs right there for you. Well, DR, here's my actual last question. If people want to get a hold of you or want to shoot you a DM or connect with you, what's the best way to do so?
LinkedIn. LinkedIn's probably the easiest place. Just shoot me a note on LinkedIn.
Cool. We'll make sure to link your profile in there. And for those who are listening, I guarantee you know somebody who needs to hear this episode. So make sure you send this along to them, or make sure you hit subscribe on the Rising Leader podcast. But with that, my friend David, thank you, sir.
Awesome. Always fun.
Thanks for listening to the Rising Leader podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you get notified every time a new episode releases. If you know someone who wants to take their lives and their career to the next level, send them this episode so we can all rise together. For more information, check out alluviance.co. We'll see you next time. And in the meantime, keep letting it flow.